Clarence Flower. My wife Eva is at my side, both down there and up here. I'm going to beg your indulgence and start this episode with something a bit unique. I'm going to read a series of dates and international, national events and local events that occurred on those dates. My hope is that by doing that, you will gain a perspective of what influenced our lives and the lives of the other presenters. I guarantee you there will be no test. Okay? Yes. I'm going to start with 1825. 1825 was the year the Erie Canal opened. That opening had a significant impact on Richmond, Michigan. Jump to 1873. Remington, a gun manufacturer, produces the first commercially available typewriter. That's the year of my birth. 1877, Edison invents the phonograph. Has significant influence on our lives. 1885, George Eastman manufactures coated photographic paper. 1885, the same George Eastman produces the Kodak camera. Again, important in my life. 1893, local stuff. Ford builds his first car in Detroit. Ford's was a tricycle, three-wheeled vehicle. Benz in Germany builds a four-wheel vehicle at the same year. 1895, Gillette safety razor and the first pro football game. 1898, the first photo using artificial light. Also, the Spanish-American War started. 1901, first motor-driven bicycles.
Now, wait a minute, Clarence. Just a minute now. I think I should talk a little bit now, too. Now, of course, I am Clarence's wife. I am Eva Flowers. And I was born in 1874. And then we were married in 1897. Isn't that right?
Correct.
Yes. And we had 2 daughters and 1 son. And you know what? I was a musician, and I taught piano, and I taught people to sing, and it was a very delightful. And as a matter of fact, I think Clarence will attest to this. I helped with the family finances with my teaching. Now we had 2 daughters and 1 son, and our son Russell worked with the electric company at that time. He was in his early 20s, and he was married and he had 1 little son. And anyway, he went to work one day, and in that day, they didn't pay much attention to safety practices and that sort of thing. And he went up the pole and was killed. He died. And it was so tragic. It was just terrible. And he had that 1 little boy. And so the whole family gathered around, and we helped raise that little boy. His name was Russell. That's it, right? And especially, of course, I gave him the music lessons and everything. He seemed quite musical. And so that's how we raised him. But it was a very sad. You should tell more about his experiences.
I will.
Okay, I will sit down.
Back to dates. 1903, Wilbur and Orville write the first powered flight. 1905, Ty Cobb starts his career with the Detroit Tigers. 1906, the San Francisco earthquake, 700 people killed. Also important in my life, the first broadcast on a radio of both voice and music. Interesting for my wife as well. Color photography in 1907. General Motors Company formed in 1908 in Detroit. and the first Model T Ford came off the production line in 1908. 1909, Bakelite handles for kitchen appliances, the birth of the plastics age. 1912, Titanic sinking, Jim Thorpe, an American Indian, dominated the Olympics. 1914, World War II, Panama Canal opens, and the census reports that 10.5 million immigrants entered the United States between 1905 and 1914.
Well, just a minute, Clarence. I think I should tell more about our family. I want you to know one thing. I had more dinners on the table waiting for this man, who was such a busy man. He was a farmer. Yes, you were. And he was a house painter. He was out there painting houses, and he painted signs for all the businesses in Richmond, you know, the big signs. And then he monkeyed around with that newfangled thing called that camera thing. And he'd go out and take pictures of the houses in town, or the business in town, or the streets, and the buggy and the horse and all that business. He'd take all those pictures, and then he'd come home and go in the dark room. Oh, he spent so much time in there because it was a dark room. The window had to be sealed up and not any sunlight come through. And then there was this machine like this, and there was a tiny, I don't know, some sort of blue light in there, and he was working with this paper that was for photographs, you know, photograph paper, and he'd somehow get it in there and click a button, and it would do something to that paper, and it was still white, you know, nothing on it. And then he'd take that paper, that photograph paper, and put it in a dish like this, maybe a little bit bigger. He had little pieces that went in there, and there was all chemicals in there, and then all of a sudden the pictures came up. That's how he made the pictures. And then he'd pick them up, and he'd have to dry them. Now, I think it was a wonderful thing that he spent so much time. I mean, when you think of history, that he went out and took pictures of houses and took pictures of people, even though it was just black and white. You know, I mean, that's all we had, black and white. I always thought maybe we could color the sky blue and the grass green or something like that, but I guess sometimes people colored in pink cheeks if they took a picture of somebody, but mostly he did black and white. But he was so busy in there. But in the meantime, my dinner was waiting to be served. Well, all right, go ahead, Clarence.
1917, 4 women were arrested for picketing the White House. They received 6-month jail sentences. Women's suffrage was on the move. Also, Prohibition started in Michigan 3 years before it became national. 1918, World War I ends. 1920, the 19th Amendment giving the right to vote to women was passed. 1921, newspapers extensively report
I voted.
tremendous Ku Klux Klan violence in the Deep South. 1922 was the first use of insulin. There is a Richmond connection. 1923, first birth control clinics opened in New York City. 1924, Ford produces his 10 millionth car. Also of interest, there are 2.5 million radios active in the United States.
Oh, we had so much fun with those radios. You know, I know he used to repair them, and some people had radios, but we would all sit around the radio and listen for hours. It was just wonderful. So surprising. Excuse me.
1925, Al Jolson's record Sonny Boy sells 12 million copies in 4 weeks. There was lots of disposable income in 1925. But go to 1929, the stock market crashes, and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre occurred in Chicago. 1930, comic strips are gaining popularity in newspapers. Blondie is the leading comic strip at the time.
years.
Popular songs of the time: Walkin' My Baby Back Home, Georgia on My Mind, and Three Little Words, still favorites of mine. 1932, Amelia Earhart's solo flight across the Atlantic. But unemployment in the United States, 1932, 13.7 million people are unemployed. 1934, attempting to get out of the Depression, Cole Porter's musical Anything Goes opens in New York City. 1935, Alcoholics Anonymous is organized for the first time in New York City. The CIO is organized by John Lewis, and Detroit wins the World Series. 1936, the Olympics are in Berlin. Jesse Owens, an African-American, dominates.
You know what, Clarence? You didn't tell him about when you had your accidents.
I'm going to.
Well, I think you should tell them about that.
I'm going to.
All right.
1936, the Lindbergh baby was also kidnapped. 1937, Joe Louis wins the heavyweight championship for the city of Detroit. Snow White and Seven Dwarfs is released by Disney. 1938, Orson Welles broadcasts the War of the Worlds. It terrorizes the nation. 1939, the first baseball game is televised. DDT is synthesized, and the first helicopter successfully flies. Now,
It's way after
to our
I was
story.
born. We were going way after.
Important for one additional perspective, Eva and I were born approximately 7 years after the end of the American Civil War. Still a major influence. I had a very limited formal education, but as we share our experience, I hope to convince you that I was self-taught, I was motivated, I was interested in culture and music.
He married a music teacher. Good boy.
Eva brought the culture and the music appreciation to our family. My parents were New Yorkers. They came to Michigan via the Erie Canal. My mom was extremely active in Richmond. She was a member of the Congregational Church and the Ladies' Aid Society. She lived to 79, a long, full life. My dad, Reuben, was a laborer. He lived to 75, also a long, full life. There were three of us. My brother Byron, he was 6 years older than I. He was a Richmond High School graduate, and he went on to medical school at Case Western Reserve. Case Western Reserve was at that time, and is to this date, a very prestigious medical school. He enjoyed a long practice in the state of Ohio. We had two sisters who were married, Mrs. Franklin Brown and Mrs. Mildred Cuckers. Eva, in addition to raising our children, gave music lessons during many of our married years.
I really did.
I
made money.
Her income was invaluable, as I had a series of health issues and we had a serious domestic issue. Our son Russell was killed, as Eva outlined, when a pole broke in downtown Mount Clemens. He fell over 30 feet. The broken portion of the pole fell on him, and he died in St. Joseph's Hospital in Mount Clemens, Michigan, approximately 24 hours after the fall. His date was October 21st, 1932. He left a widow and a son, Dean. And again, as Eva informed you, our entire family unit assisted in raising Dean. A little more about Dean. He was a Richmond High School graduate. He was a saxophone player. He enlisted in the United States Navy, and he was selected to play in the Navy band.
The United States Navy Band.
He played local concerts as well, and there is lore that when saxophone was featured in musical arrangements, other saxophone players on the stage would put their instrument in their lap and listen to him. He was that accomplished. He also had a long career in radio. Eva's influence over generations, perhaps my influence a bit in his selection of radio. I personally had two major health issues. Both involved motorcycle accidents. The first one led to a 17-month house confinement. The second one, I was incapacitated for over 6 months. And that second one was a significant financial strain in that I was in business for myself.
But I stayed by his side, by golly, and I kept teaching, and I kept making some money, and I canned, and did things like that. We made it through.
About my occupations, I was a sign painter. I was also a house painter. But I'm most proud of the fact that I engaged in two emerging technologies. I was a photographer. I opened a studio here in Richmond in 1923. The techniques of photography were rapidly changing. From glass slides and large projectors to dip technique with lots of time spent titrating chemicals to cameras with film. My special interest was street scenes of the local communities. I did lots of them. I made postcards of them. Some of them postcards survive to this day. My second career was in radio. I built, repaired, and retailed radios. I had a particular interest in ham radio. At the time I got involved, ham radio was not regulated by the FCC. So we built big, powerful radios, had to modify them downwards in terms of power as the FCC began to regulate ham radio. My grandson Dean had a long career in radio. He had an interest in ham.
We saw a lot of changes in our life. We really did when you think about it.
As Eva and I rest here, we would like to thank you for your attention, and we would also like you to consider participation in the Richmond Area Historic and Genealogic Society. We are searching for members. Please take our literature and contact members if you choose. Thank you for your attention.
All right. I'm George Weston.
Hello, George.
I've been asleep for about 111 years, so I might forget some stuff. All right, I'll try to do my best. My parents, Lancy and Elizabeth, were born in New Hampshire at the beginning of the 19th century. They had 4 sons, and I'm the youngest of them. And when I say 4 sons, that's because one of them died, so they really had 5, but Leonard, the second oldest, died when he was 5 years old. When I was born in 1846, the family decided to move to Chesterfield here in Macomb County and take up farming. And we farmed there for a while. Then the Civil War came about, and my brother Clark signed up with the 9th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. And 3 months later, he was dead. He died of disease, which was not uncommon. As many men, if not twice as many men, died of disease in that war as died from bullets.
Good idea.
Come on up to the front. We're all friends.
Oops.
We're going to be right on top of you.
Okay. We'll try that again. I think I'm using my loudest voice, but yeah, we do have a lot of traffic out here. By 1870, I'm living in Richmond, and I have a blind and sash business. I'm making blinds and sashes, or sashes and blinds. It's window treatments. 1875, I get my oldest brother Holmes to come in, and we start the business of a planing mill, or lumber yard. It eventually becomes a lumber yard, but it's a planing mill to start with. Okay? In a planing mill, what they're basically doing is they're taking rough sawn lumber, they're running it through a plane to smooth it down, get it to exact dimensions. Sometimes in the planing process they'll put various shapes to it, so it's for molding and things like that. So they get that started. That business is located, and you can see this here maybe. That business is located on Division south of Forest. Okay? When I was growing up, it was known as Meade Lumber, so if that's any kind of a reference point there, or Richmond Lumber. In that same year, I marry Jane Bowman, and she didn't like to be called Jane. She preferred to be called Jenny, and so from then on, we're just going to refer to her as Jenny. In fact, on our headstone, it says Jenny. It does not say Jane. Okay? We have 3 boys. The first one dies at 7 months. The second one, his name was Winfred. We called him Fred. And the third one was Clark. Clark, as he grows up, he becomes a farmhand. At one point, he's working on a farm for an aunt and uncle. But eventually, he moves to California, and he becomes a garage mechanic. Fred stays here in town, okay, and he will eventually come into the business with me. All right. So that gets us up through 1875. We're still a long ways to go. At that point, we find that my son, Fred, marries Lenora Schnell, and they have a son that they name George Robert Weston. Keep that in mind because we're going to talk about him a little bit later. Holmes and I are running this business, but by 1885, he decides he's really not interested in the lumber business, and he sells out his share to Daniel Rapelli, who's my brother-in-law. He's my brother-in-law because he married my wife's sister, Elizabeth, who prefers to be called Elizabeth. Okay? And in fact, when you get a chance, you get around to the other side here and you look at these 2 gravestones, this is my gravestone with my wife, Jenny, and over here is Daniel Rapelli and his wife, Elizabeth. Not Elizabeth, Elizabeth. Okay? Those sisters were sort of strange in terms of their names, I guess. So, at any rate, Holmes in 1885, Holmes is no longer interested in doing lumber business. He sells out his share to Daniel, as I said, and he moves to Mayfield, Michigan, where he sets up a apple drying business, or an apple evaporator. Here in Richmond, we had one down in Muttonville. Basically, it's a way of preserving apples. They get them all dried out, and they can ship them all over the place. They don't rot. Water causes them to rot, so they dry them out. So he's doing that. Daniel becomes my partner. We're running the business there, and it's going along pretty good. And eventually, what happens is that he gets old enough that he wants to retire. So he sells out his share to myself and my son, Fred. And now we have the business. And Daniel retires. In wrong century, 1925, there's a fire, and it's caused by an electrical spark from two wires that arc together during a storm, and that's the business. We've got $35,000 worth of damage. The machinery is destroyed, the business offices are destroyed, a lot of the lumber that we'd already planed was destroyed, and so we had that big fire. And that's where I'm going to turn it over to Brian here, because there's an interesting side story to that fire. Brian, you're on. This is Brian Shoddy.
All right, so, excuse me. So in 1925, when the fire occurred, for the city's fire protection, they would have had a hand-drawn hand pumper. They also had a hand-drawn ladder wagon. And they also had, a few years before the fire, purchased a chemical engine, which was a Model T with basically two giant fire extinguishers mounted on the back of it. So they didn't have any mechanical pumping or anything like that. Well, when the fire occurred, it just so happened this truck you see behind me actually was built for the city of Sibley, Michigan, or Village. It actually no longer exists. However, when the salesman went to deliver it, their city council looked at it and said, "This is way too fancy, we're not paying for it." So the salesman decided just to drive it around, show it off, see if he could make up some sales. Comes here and actually was at the Richmond Hotel that night sleeping when the fire started. They ended up, the lady from the telephone office had seen the truck parked there, so she had somebody go over, wake him up. He volunteered to help. They used the truck to put out the fire, and the next day the village council purchased the truck. And actually, I took and I saw a thing from the American France company. It was from, like, I think, like the 70s, and they actually mentioned this thing as how, you know, demonstrations work to sell trucks. So, and it's been with the city ever since. That's about all I got. The city still owns it, yes. Yep. Yeah, and actually, what's that? Yeah, they took taxes a while to pay it off, but they paid it off, yeah. So I mean, at the time, that was, you know, a pretty major purchase. You know, in 1925 to, I think it was like $7,000. Oh, wow, that's nice. So.
Yeah, they did have to run a millage, but that was offset by the insurance rates.
Right.
We got better insurance rates, lowered them, and more made up for paying the millage on the truck. So it was a win-win situation type thing. Got any more?
No, that's all I got, unless anybody's got any questions or anything afterwards.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. So now we got things going along pretty good, and I die.
Oh.
Okay. 1911, I die. I shouldn't really know anything past this. Right, I'm dead. But what happens is that my son, who'd become my business partner, continues to run the business, okay, and he will run it, and in 1934 his son will join in and help run the business. That's George Robert, and that lasts until 1951, and in 1951 my son passes away, my grandson takes over the business, and shortly after that he sells it. And that's basically the end of the story.
How did it make it to the Depression?
I think they took drugs or something. No, I don't know. Everybody struggled during the Depression. You made ends meet the best way you could. And we know, for example, we take a look at our economy today, we know that things are happening, and yet people are working and they're getting by. It's just the way it is. We have people that in the village here, we have a log cabin. It's the Donnelly Log Cabin. They were living in Detroit. Depression hits. They come back out here to work on the farm. Their farmhouse burns. They move into the log cabin until they can get another house built. You do what you got to do. It's basically what it comes down to. So, anything else?
Yeah, the Richmond Hotel that the guy was staying at, what's the commercial house, or is there another hotel?
I'm not sure. I'm guessing it's the commercial house because then the telephone exchange, I think, was across the street. So that would make sense as to how the operator saw the truck then.
You go, if I remember it correctly, and I might be wrong, the commercial house, Richmond Hotel, Chaps.
Right, yeah, but I was just thinking about the era that the fire...
Well, the fire is 1925, probably the commercial house.
Okay.
Probably, I'm not positive of that.
But I remember the telephone exchange being across the street, so, all right.
Anything else?
Good job, thank you.
Thank you. Before they traveled to Michigan. By 1831, they had traveled to Mount Clemens, and in 1836 moved to Lenox Township, purchased property, farmed, and had added another 5 children to their family. My father, James Claggett, was the 7th child born in 1830 to Richard and Frances. He grew up on the family farm in Lenox Township, where he met my mother, Jemima Harmon. They were married in 1855. They had 4 children. The firstborn, a daughter, died in infancy. Then came my brother Melvin, 10 years older than I, my sister Chrissy, 6 years older than I, and I, Letty Hazel, was the baby of the family. I have some pictures of myself as a baby. And here I am about 2 years old. And about 4. All 3 of us were born on the family farm on Gratiot in Lenox. I had a wonderful sisterly relationship, sharing so many times together, and of course, arguing and fighting with each other as sisters sometimes do. Chrissy and I spent many hours stringing apples and other fruits on long strings and hanging them near the stove to dry. We would use them to make pies or other cooking in the winter. We learned to sew, and Mother, Chrissy, and I made most of our clothes. Chrissy became quite a fine seamstress, often making clothes for others in town. She eventually married a freight train conductor and moved to Saginaw. They had 1 child, a son named Harry. Unfortunately, Chrissy's husband died, and she and Harry returned to Richmond and made their home with our parents, James and Jemima. They eventually moved to Detroit, and Harry worked for my brother Mel at his store. I attended Richmond High School, and it was there that I met the love of my life, Alton Bailey. Isn't he handsome? Mm-hmm. He was my boyfriend all through my school years. I graduated in 1896 from Richmond in a class of 12 students. Here I am on the corner. Alton went on to Michigan Agricultural College in Lansing, which in 1964 was renamed Michigan State University. Then in 1901, we were married. Here's our wedding picture. And this is my lovely wedding dress. Alton obtained a job with the Peninsula Portland Cement Company. He had studied electrical engineering and could apply his knowledge to the planning and construction of new cement plants. We traveled all over the country, staying a year or so at each location while a new plant was being built. Many of these were in very rural areas. We traveled to Jackson, Michigan, Durham, Ontario, Georgia, and Independence City, Kansas, and to many other towns across the nation.
In 1905, I celebrated the 50th wedding anniversary of my parents. Elton was unfortunately not able to come, but my sister Chrissy, her son Harry, there's me, and my brother Mel were able to come for the 50th wedding anniversary. I was growing very tired of traveling and living in boarding houses and hotels, and when we finally stopped in Mason City, Iowa, I put my foot down. I told Elton this was the last stop. I wanted a home and a place to settle down. So Mason City became our home, where Elton became the plant operating engineer. Our life was blessed in 1914 when our daughter Winifred was born. There's a picture of me with Winifred. And Winifred with her daddy, Elton. She was a joy of our life, and it was said that Elton's father, George, was so elated when we wired him the announcement of Winifred's birth that he was quoted as saying, "I feel just like running a foot race." When Winifred was about a year old, we came to Richmond to visit with our parents, and they saw our precious little girl for the first time. Here you can see my father holding little Winifred. We stayed on another 2 years in Iowa, but we learned my father had become very ill. So we packed our bags and in 1916 came back to Richmond and moved into the beautiful home Elton's father had built. And this home still exists today. It's on the corner of Park and Parker. If you want to go drive by it, it looks pretty much like this. Unhappily, though, we did not get back in time for me to say my goodbyes to my father, who passed away before we arrived. In 1917, Elton and I moved to Detroit, where he took a job as manager and chief engineer of the power plant at the Packard Motor Company. Elton remained at this position into the early 1920s. About 1921, we moved back to Richmond, to the Bailey family home, to be with Elton's father, George, who needed comfort and care. We decided to modernize and enlarge the house. The dining room was doubled in size. A new woodshed with an oil-fired furnace was added, and an inside bathroom. Grandpa Bailey had his own washstand in the kitchen and preferred to continue to use the outhouse behind the barn, but I loved the inside bathroom. The next 7 years proved to be the most painful and sad years of my life. Elton became ill with pneumonia, and in a mere 4 days, passed away on March 29, 1922. It was almost impossible to believe that my dear Elton was gone and only 44 years old. Winifred was just about 8 years old. She looked about like this when her father died. She and I continued to live with George Bailey in the beautiful home in Richmond. Only 2 years later, when Winifred was 10 years old, she became ill with pneumonia and passed away at 10 years old. She had the most sunny and cheerful disposition, and I felt if someone had ripped my heart out of my body. Her funeral was held in our home, and it seemed every citizen of Richmond came to pay their respects, as everyone in town knew her and loved her. My father-in-law, George, was just as deeply saddened by the loss, as she was a constant comfort to him. A mere 3 years later, in 1928, he quietly passed away. Quite suddenly, I found myself alone in this large house. Although I kept busy in organizations in town and church and serving on the school board, I needed to find some solutions to being alone. One solution was that I loaned out the parlor for viewing of those who had died. The visitors would come through the parlor door, past the casket, and out the front door. I would decorate the doors with black wreaths and flowers, and I would fill the lobby with flower arrangements. The other solution was I started renting out rooms to school teachers. 2 very good friendships resulted from this, Marion Stewart and Velma Sweet. I also made another decision after Winifred died and bought a cottage at Orchard Beach on the St. Clair River in St. Clair, Michigan. All 3 of these solutions kept me busy and I could be around people. I loved going to the cottage every summer. I would invite my sister Chrissy and her family to come and spend a week or two at the cottage with me. I actually had them come several times a year. Now, as I said before, my sister and I loved each other very much, but after we'd been together for a bit of time, we inevitably found ourselves arguing about something. I guess it was just a basic part of our relationship, but those times together at the cottage really saved me from focusing on the sadness of my losses. Velma Sweet stayed with me in that big house until she moved to teaching in Lincoln Park. She would come back most weekends. We would have great fun roaming around town. Velma eventually got married, and she and her husband moved into a new house in Richmond. Velma's older sister, Bertha, was a nurse, and when she retired, she moved in with Velma and her husband. Eventually, she grew tired of that arrangement and moved in with me. The two of us remained friends and companions for many years. I did get to do something fun when I was 62 in 1940. I went on a 6-week cross-country trip with friends Mr. and Mrs. Irwin Fenton and Mr. W.L. Rowley. In mid-January, we left for the south and southwestern parts of the country. We saw lots of scenery on the way and bought some fine cotton to exhibit when we got back home. When we got as far as Yuma, Arizona, on the way to California, there was a border inspection. Hundreds of cars were lined up for officers to look the cars over. Our group lost our choice sample of cotton, and our Michigan apples were also confiscated. We had those for lunch purposes, for heaven's sake. All were deemed unfit by the inspector to cross the border into California. But we were then able to go into California, and I was able to visit my brother Melvin in Huntington Park, California. It was a lovely trip. Many have said that I was very good-natured and had an optimistic outlook. I suppose being optimistic is what helped me live a long life. I lived happily in my home and celebrated my last Christmas in 1967 with my nephew's family and, of course, my dear friend Bertha. I was always an early riser, but 2 mornings after Christmas, Bertha found me in bed. I had passed away during the night. While there had been some very difficult times, there had been many very happy events in my life of 89 years in this wonderful village of Richmond. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering if the Bailey Park in Richmond is named after this Bailey family, you're right. It was named after Eugene Bailey, who was my husband's uncle, my father-in-law's brother. Thank you for your attention, and feel free to browse the items on the table. Okay. By the way, this is Winifred's baby book that Letty kept. If you want to take a look through, there's some pictures in there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let me start off my story here. My name is Obie Evans. Going to be later known as Obie Osmond Baker Evans, later to be known as Obie Evans, later to be known as Obie, and just before I passed, I became the walking encyclopedia of Richmond, as well as the grand old man of Richmond. So I changed we all change over time. We all change over time. Matter of fact, where do we have a picture of me? This is me during part of my time. But there's some other pictures down here I'll show you later on. And I'll give you a quick overview of my life, and then we're going to go between the dashes on your cemetery stone between the beginning and the end, at least as far as on Earth anyway. But anyway, I'm going to be a farmer most of my life, and later on I'm going to become a businessman, and I'll tell you how that happened, and that's through my wife's kind of influence and her father. And later on I'm going to become the mayor of Richmond, kind of like the mayor, the head of the city council, the president, and I'm going to do that for 25 years, the longest sitting person in the city of Richmond ever until this date. I think your mayor here is almost on 25 years now or something like that, but hopefully I will keep that record, but who knows. And then later on, as we go on, I'm going to end up here in 1948, 10 years before my wife, May. We're buried next to each other. Her father is over there, who's a very influential man, and we'll speak about him shortly. So, where did I come from? How did I get here? Why am I in Richmond? Well, at the age of 6,
my father, along with my other 7 brothers and sisters and mother, came here from Cork Island, Ireland, and we settled at St. Clair County. So actually I'm a St. Clairian, but not for very long. After that period of time, when we lived up there, we moved within a year down here to Richmond. And my father was destined to be a farmer all his life. And I was going to be a farmer to begin with, but that will eventually change. So, and what about my future wife, May? She comes here at the age of 2 from New York with her family, and there's about 8 kids over there also. So they actually moved into Richmond, and she's a Richmond lady. She's going to graduate from Richmond High School later on, and I think it's 1888 she's going to graduate. And so we'll continue on. I have a little sheet here with dates because there's several reasons for that. One, I'm 89 years old. I'm becoming feeble. They call it Alzheimer's. And I'm also going blind. And I'm going to die at age 89. In my house, where May also died in our house. And so people like to keep things in order, so we have a time track going down with dates and everything. And thirdly, I don't want May or somebody else to rise out of their grave and tell me I gave the wrong date at a wrong time or told the wrong secrets, because there are some little secrets too along the way. Well, one little one, mainly me, but that's another story. But anyway, so we're going to travel on, and eventually my future wife May, her mother dies at the age of 7. And when they came here from New York, they came with the Reverend Baker, Charles Baker. And what's my middle name? Baker. That gives you a little secret. Now, after her mother died, she came and lived with them. It's sort of like an adoption. Years ago, people came and lived with different families for different reasons. Sometimes you couldn't support the big family. Sometimes, I hate to say it, sometimes someone becomes an alcoholic and abusive and they go to live with somebody else. Or maybe somebody couldn't afford to keep all those kids, and part of the family, which is usually a family member a lot of times, like the Reverend was, they wanted a child, they didn't have any, so she went and lived with them, and she grew up with them. And that's how I'm going to get my middle name later on, Baker, because he was a very important person. And they were Methodist. Years ago, churches were very much involved with their own little groups. Some of them are today, but now people, you know, if you were a Jewish boy, mom wanted you to marry a good Jewish girl or a good Jewish boy, or if you were a Catholic, you had to be married to a good Catholic boy or a good Catholic girl. Well, the Protestants were the same way. And usually you're out on a farm, right? You're working 6 days a week, 1 day off, Sunday. So everybody goes to church. Churches were very important years ago. They're not so important as today. But before, you didn't marry out of your group. You stayed with your little group. And you didn't have, you couldn't marry the girl next door because there's nobody next door. She lives maybe a mile away or whatever, 2 miles away or whatever. So you went to church, you stayed with your own little group, and eventually I thought that May would be a good woman to marry. And we were in the same religion. And of course, her father was Methodist too. They're all Methodists now. We're all going to the same church, and you're not associating with other groups of people because you've got your own little church and you don't have time. You're working from morning to night out on a farm, and you come in on Sunday. So you go to their activities, you stay for the dinners afterwards, you socialize with your own little group. And that's the way it was all the time. So eventually, May and I get married. May is 25 and I'm 33, which is kind of old. And eventually, this is May, when she was younger. You can pass this around if you want. Sometimes people grow old graciously. Some people don't. That's May later on in life. She's gained some weight, but if you look at her face, you can tell it's the same person. Sometimes you go to what they call class reunions now, And you won't recognize the person after when you're 50, 60, or 70 years old. You wonder, wow, what happened? But anyway, this is very important too. She's important because we weren't blessed with any kids. So I devoted my time, she devoted her time. She was on a lot of social activities, so was I, and we went to church on Sunday. We eventually moved from where my father was up in St. Clair. Well, actually he moved down to Big Hand Road over here after I was just a year old. So we were living outside of Richmond, and my wife and I got a farm down in Lenox. So we were living there. And actually, one of my father actually got married 2 years after his wife died, because he got 8 kids. Who's going to take care of 8 kids? You're working from morning till night. You need somebody to help. So a lot of times, years ago, you would marry your sister's, your wife's sister, her cousin, or somebody else in the family along there, because you needed somebody to take care of the kids. And nowadays, you can marry somebody in France or Italy or wherever you're going to go on these trips all over the place. Not like years ago. So you stay with your own little group, and you're married within your own little group. A lot of different things happen these days. So anyway, that's me, and of course that's me. Do I look the same? Do I look the same? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And later on, May's father was very influential. He's right over here. You see him? He's right there standing next to that stone. If you don't see him, he's there. I see him. You can't see him, but I can see him. So anyway, he was a very influential person. At the age of 14, he learned his letters, meaning he learned to read and write at the age of 14. He was very progressive in regard to reading and writing and that. He ends up going to U of M and becomes a lawyer, an attorney at law. And May was very much influenced by him and how hard he worked and everything and that. And we used to get the newspaper all the time from Richmond and bring it out to the farm. And she even had some of his little cards, attorney at law, that he was advertising in a paper, and had some cards made up. So anyway, I'm working on a farm, it's morning till night. And we go to their house, they come to our house, and he's talking and everything and that. All of a sudden in the paper, we find an article. Well, they want to hire somebody to sell motors and threshing machines in Port Huron. So I'm talking to Joseph Chubbs, which is her father over there, and talking to my wife, and we're in all these social activities now. We're living outside. It's pretty hard working out on a farm 6 days a week. So, and the people come out on the 7th day and eat all your food, and then you got to work again on Monday. But anyway, so we talked about that. So I go to work. So around 1900, after working on a farm for about 8 years, I go and start as a salesman for him. Well, I become #1 salesman. I was very good. I liked people. We talked a lot. I gave them all fair prices. I became the #1 salesman. And I met everybody in town. I'm riding around on my buggy with the horse and everything and that. And all of a sudden the people in town, they get to know me. I get to know them. We're going to all the stores and everything. And lo and behold, 1905, I get elected president of the city council. And only because I know all these people and I give them fair prices, and we do a lot of work together and we all cooperate, which I guess the president now doesn't cooperate with a lot of people, or a lot of people don't cooperate with him. But we're a small community, so you wear different hats. I'm on the school board, I'm mayor, kind of like the mayor of the town, I'm president, and I do that for 25 years. The longest man to live on a council or any type of activity for the city of Richmond. So I do that for 25 years, and during those 25 years, eventually we do a lot of things together. Small community. I'm still working, selling stuff. I worked for 37 years for this tractor supply company, so I'm still working because, it's a small-time job. You got a small community. You only have meetings, once every couple weeks, and, I'm going here and there and everywhere. So our city, when I start working for the city, it's $25,000 in debt. It's like $700,000 in today's prices. And when I end my term after 25 years, we got $5,000 in the treasury. I like to say I did that, but I really didn't do it. You got to have people that cooperate and want to work together. So what do? We had 2 school districts. I don't know if you go through Richmond, you'll find out that you have businesses, then you have houses and you have businesses. It's like, where's the real downtown, you know? Different places. Eventually we're going to get Muttonville way after I pass. It's going to become part of Richmond to Muttonville, down by the traffic light down there. So you got all kinds of businesses. So Ridgeway, Cooper's Town, BB's Corners, all these are coming together and we're making one small community. And some of them use different names and addresses because they're all small and everybody wants to keep their name, but eventually it becomes the city of Richmond, period. So, anyway, what are we doing now? Oh yeah, that's right, I remember. What are we doing now? You know, some people wonder why some of these farm people had so many kids. You think that, oh, I want a lot of kids so I can put them to work out on a farm. Not really. You don't have the internet, you don't have a phone, you don't have a radio until 1894. You work till morning to night, so what are you going to do? But I got to tell you a little secret too. When we got, when my parents got married, they got married on December 30th. And I was born on August 9th. Now, if you go by your hand, I think that's 8 months. Anyway, that happens today too. Who knows? We lived together, we stayed together. We did a lot of things, a lot of social things for the activities for the city. Matter of fact, May is working for the up in Port Huron at what's that, the Herald Gazette over there. She works there for 10 years, and when she passes in 1938, she's the last person of her class from the Richmond High School of 1888. She's the last one to pass. I'm going to pass 10 years later, and actually they have this wheelchair up here because in my last couple of years I was becoming feeble. I used to walk through the town all the time. They called me Richmond's walking encyclopedia. Anybody got encyclopedias at home anymore? Okay, one person. Yeah, that's so. If you want information, you have to go in there. You can't talk in this little device and ask questions at that time. So I'm walking around town after she dies. I'm walking around town, and people asking me questions because they want to know the history of it. They want to do this. So I continue doing that. I continue walking around, and 10 years later, I'm going to pass. And I got this wheelchair just before the Lions Club in Richmond is one of the first organizations ever to have items that you can give out to people in need. So they gave it to me, and I was the first person to get one. That's a replica of my old wheelchair. My wheelchair is long gone, long gone. It all fell apart, like me. But anyway, so that's what happened, and actually there's a very interesting story about my death. I was actually, in 1911, we started a Masonic temple here. I was one of the chartered first members, along with her father, Joseph over there, and that was in 1911. I became the scribe of the Masons. You know what the scribe is? Any idea? It's a man of letters. It's just like a newspaper man. You're the secretary, the person who writes out the information on it and even gives it to the editor, and he puts it in the paper. You're a scribe. You're the person who does the writing. So I became secretary. When I died, the Masonic people came out here, gave me my last rites. I died in my house. My house is still there. This is my house. And remember I told you the Methodist church was very important? If you go in town, you'll see the Methodist church almost across the street from me. That's my house. I died there in that house in 48. In 38, my wife May died there, and the church is across the street. That's how important churches were at that time. Not so much now, still, but not that much. So you had a big, so the Masons came out here and gave me my last rites. I had my last rites at the house, across the street in the church, and out here at the cemetery. And my service was on Tuesday at 2:30. And you won't, this is very unusual. This is the first time this has ever happened, and never happened before in the city of Richmond. They closed their businesses from 2:30 to 3:30. And it brings a tear to my eye, because they thought I was so important of a person to do that. And I never ever became what they call now a couch potato. I always worked for the city. I did my best. I became a very, not wealthy, but a well-to-do salesman. And I did my job in Richmond for 25 years, and I continued afterwards walking the streets until I died. So I think, I don't know how much time I have or what time it is, but I think, let me check my time, because I wanted to mention a couple other things if we have time. I don't know if we have time. Oh, you know, when I worked in the city as a salesman, because I kept that sales job, as a president, you only have a couple meetings during the month. There's not a whole lot going on. But during that time, we paved the Main Street in cement for the first time. That was the first street that was ever paved. There were two school districts, kind of in east and west, and we combined them into one. I like to say I did it, but I didn't really do it. We did it because you have to have cooperation. I never pushed anybody to do anything. I only pointed out what would be good and maybe what would be bad. And like I said, we were never blessed with kids. My life would have been different totally had we had children, but we didn't. So I converted all my time in working for the city and talking to people and being a salesman. So that's my story, and I probably missed a lot along the way, but you know, I try to give it to you in kind of an order. People like things in order. Dates aren't important, but you get the concept of what a person does throughout their entire life. And I hope that as you grow older, you don't become a couch potato after you retire. I didn't. I continued walking the streets, talking to people and shopping, and they all asked me questions. That's why I was called the old grand man of Richmond, as well as a walking encyclopedia. They wanted to know why things were here, what was here, and I continue to do that until the day I die. Anybody have anything they'd like to ask me? I don't know if I can remember.
Was the house?
Pardon me?
I was going to say your house. What corner is it on Main Street? What's the other corner? Is it church?
The church is on the other corner.
Oh, I know. I used to
Yeah.
Which way?
I think the address
corner.
69625 Main,
So
and it's beige and brown.
So is it so if you're facing the church, is it to the
If
right?
the church,
Okay,
the church
just
is,
across.
it's not across the street, it's next to it, on the
Okay.
corner right there. You can see my house. I died in that house, May died in that house. We had our services in that house. We were taken across the street to the Methodist church, and back out here where we stopped dead, right here. Stop dead right there. You get that? Stop dead. Anyway. Anybody have any questions? No? Well, I guess you might as well go along all your way and watch out for those cemetery stones as you walk. And if you see anybody, wave to them. Don't take anybody home with you now, because they're not supposed to do that.
Oh my, I've been looking through this album and all the memories and Lennox and the children that I raised. Well, my name is Louise Shulman Springborn. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, some about my husband, the wonderful Ferdinand Springborn, and the 5 children that I helped raise. I was born in 1865, and my parents were German. I was actually born in Lennox, lived there my whole life. And when I was 6 years old, my father passed away, and that left my mother with myself and my siblings, so we had to learn how to take care of ourselves. That's something that we just had to do. And I became a very fine dressmaker. Oh, I would make the most beautiful dresses, wedding dresses, and girls that wanted to go to dances, and communion dresses, and baptism dresses. I was a very, very fine dressmaker. Well, at the same time, there was a man by the name of Ferdinand that lived in China, in St. Clair, on a farm. And he came to the United States when he was 2 years old with his parents, who were also German. And they settled in that area and became farmers. Well, next to the Springborn farm out there was a family by the name of Brenner. And there was a young lady by the name of Emma that lived there on the farm. And she met Ferdinand and they fell in love. And she was 16 years old and he was 23 years old, and they married. And before you knew it, they had their first child, Edward. Well, he farmed out there next to his father. And by 1880, he had acquired 60 acres all on his own and was living there. But you know, farming was quite a tough life. And he was growing tired of farming, and he thought, there must be a better way. There has to be something I can do besides working this hard and farming. So he started looking around, and he found a little piece of property in an establishment called Ridgeway. And Ridgeway was located right next to the Grand Trunk Railway on what is now Grand Trunk Avenue in Richmond. He found that little piece of property, and he decided, I think this would be a fine place for a saloon. So he started building. Well, he is German, you know, so he started building that little saloon, and along with the saloon, he put in rooms that some of the conductors could stay in if they had to spend the night, or sometimes people were traveling to the area and they would need a room. So things were going along quite nice for him. I think I may have a picture here. Yeah, there's a picture, and things were going along quite nicely for him. And then he thought to himself, my, this saloon business is working out pretty well. I think I want to build something just a little larger, because by this time he had turned people away. He just didn't have enough rooms. So he had a vision for this grand hotel that he was going to build right there next to the little one that he had. Well, things were going along quite nicely, and then in 1890, Emma passed away from consumption. That left him with 5 children, aged 11 years to 5 years. Well, I had met Ferdinand on occasion, and I was much younger than him, because actually the first time he got married, I was only 8 years old. So I was quite a bit younger than him. But I knew him and I knew his wife, because I would go and I would watch some of the ladies come in with the dresses that I had made for them. And, you know, it was kind of a happening place back then, that Ridgeway. And in 1891, he asked me to marry him, and I did. And I took on the role of being a step-parent, a stepmother, for those 5 children. Like I said, from 5 years up to 11 years old. And let me tell you, it was some of the best years of my life. I just loved raising those children and watching them grow up. But all the time when I was raising these children and working in that little saloon, as was Ferdinand, he was also starting to build what he called his grand hotel. The big, wonderful, beautiful hotel. Well, life went along quite nicely. And in 1895, Lily met a conductor. Now, I have to tell you, all the girls in town would always come down to the Ridgeway when those trains were pulling in, because they loved seeing those conductors get off the train. You know, they had those great uniforms, and the stories they would tell about where they went and what they saw. Those trains went from Ridgeway to Pontiac to Monroe and back to Port Huron. Those conductors would get off in their uniforms, and all the girls would just be there, just looking at them and staring. Oh my goodness, it was a sight to behold. Well, our daughter Lily met Harry Harris, and he was a conductor on the Grand Trunk Railroad. They fell in love and they got married, and they were married for over 50 years. And during that whole time, he worked as a conductor for the Grand Trunk Railroad. Never took another job. There was great celebrations when he decided to retire. And of course, we know where those celebrations took place, right there at the Lennox Hotel. Now this might be a picture, I'm not sure, because you know, we didn't really mark everything, but this very well could be a picture of our daughter. We don't know that for sure, but it could be. Never put our names on anything. We're just so bad about that. So she got married in 1895, and that next year, on New Year's Eve, 1896, we opened up that grand hotel that Ferdinand dreamt about. It was built, and there it was, right on that street across from the Grand Trunk Railroad. And you can see in this picture, this was the Hotel Lennox. And on the first floor, we had the restaurant and the saloon, of course. On the second floor were the rooms that we rent out to people, and we also kept boarders in there. And on the third floor, that was the ballroom. And let me tell you, that was quite a floor. We had more parties up there and great times. And on that third floor, we even had roller skating sometimes. Can you believe that? So if you're on the second floor trying to get a good nap and they're roller skating up there, probably not going to happen, is it? But no one ever complained. They just loved being there. And in some of our rooms, we put this, a little ashtray like this, and you can see we even had it inscribed, Hotel Lennox. F. Springborn was the proprietor, and at that time, it was called Richmond, Michigan. So one of these went in every room. Well, like I said, that was 1896 when we opened up that hotel. In 1897, our son Edward got married. We had a little celebration there at the hotel. Now, nothing little was ever with Ferdinand. It was always wonderful, large events. And he married a woman by the name of Minnie. He worked at the hotel for a while, but eventually they moved to Detroit. Now, all of the children worked in the hotel on and off, as I did, and of course Ferdinand, all of our lives. We spent some years living at the hotel also. At one point, we moved out of the hotel, and our neighbor was Mr. Girk, and he's the man who owned the shoe store. So he was our neighbor at one point. Well, in 1902, our daughter Hattie got married. She was 19, and she married a man by the name of Herman Priestep. Now, Herman was the son of Albert Priestep, and Albert visited us a couple years ago. You may have heard his story if you were here, but he was a local lumberman, and she married him. She worked in the hotel. She was 19 years old. He was 20, and he was doing mill work for his father at that time in the lumber yard. So they stayed in close proximity. And then in 1903, the first 3 cars appeared in Richmond, Michigan, or Lennox, Michigan, or Ridgeway, whatever anybody was calling it at that time. And one of those cars was owned by George Bailey. You heard a little bit about George Bailey from Letty, I believe. Well, George owned one, Mr. Wetter owned one, and Elmer Gleason owned one of those cars. So those 3 men would get all dressed up and grab their wives and their beautiful dresses, and they would drive up to the Hotel Lennox, park their cars, get them out, and take them in for dinner. Or, quite often, we had bands on that 3rd floor, and they would come in for dancing. That was 1903. And by 1905, there was a woman by the name of Mrs. Guest, and she started a hat shop on top of the Macomb County Bank. And her daughter Bertha and her girlfriends would come down to the Grand Trunk area, and they would watch those Pan American trains come in on a nightly basis. And of course, you know what it was, those conductors, they were all about seeing those conductors and hearing those stories. So all those girls would giggle and laugh and hang outside the hotel. It was really quite something. You know, by this time Ferdinand had become quite well known around town. So they started calling him Fred. Ferdinand got to be a little long, I guess, so they started calling him Fred. But every year on his birthday, the Richmond Concert Band would come in and play for his birthday. And he would sit in his chair and grin from side to side. And of course, when the bartender would bring him over a beer, and he would, he would have his drink, and they would play, and then people would start dancing. So it was always a celebration for Ferdinand on his birthday every year in that hotel. Also, every year in our hotel, we did a 4th of July celebration. Every single year, 4th of July, every year a New Year's celebration, and all the things in between. We had weddings there, we had receptions there. One time, we had a reception for 300 people in that hotel. So that tells you that was a pretty good-sized crowd at that time. Now, we also had a daughter, Hattie, and Hattie married Herman Priestep. And Herman Priestep of the sawmill. And Hattie worked in the hotel for some time. Eventually, she and Herman moved to Detroit. But they always kind of stayed involved. They always came back and visit. They always stayed involved in what was going on around town. I think I have a picture here. Well, no, I have a baby picture. There's a baby picture. But they would always come back to town. He stayed very involved in town. In fact, in 1917, he bought a huge American flag and had that American flag erected in front of the Macomb County Bank. Now, true to form, you know what happened after that flag went up. We had a big party at the hotel, and there was a band, and there was dancing, and there was celebration. Anything to bring people into that hotel. Ferdinand was quite a good businessman, I think. Well, that kind of tells you a lot about my children. But life went on, and the children worked on and off at the hotel through the years, and then 1917 happened. And you may not know this, but in 1917 is when Prohibition hit Michigan. And Michigan was the first state to have Prohibition. Michigan was the first state to get rid of it, too. So 3 years before Prohibition was at the national level, it hit Michigan. And that had quite an impact on our business at the hotel. However, there were still tap dance lessons going on the 3rd floor. That didn't stop that. We still had events there, and people came in to celebrate. In 1922, the Sperry bus line came into being, and they ran a bus line from the Hotel Lenox to Port Huron to the Harrington and back and forth. In fact, the Harrington Hotel was built the same year as the Hotel Lenox. So they had a lot in common that way. In 1923, I passed away from typhoid fever. That was something that was kind of common at that time, and I got it and I passed away. But I'm going to keep telling you the story about that hotel because it was such a remarkable hotel for its day, and it really put Richmond, Lenox, Ridgeway on the map, because people would come from Detroit on the trains. They would come in, and quite often what they would do is they would go to the livery stable, which was next to the hotel at that time. They would rent a buggy and a horse, and they would take a drive out to the country. And then they would come back, and they'd go to their room, they would get fixed up, they'd go down for dinner, and if we had a band, there was dancing going on. So it really became a draw for a lot of the people from the city to come to our area. That was one of the things that the hotel did for that area, was bring others in. Anyway, I passed away, and then in 1929, the Depression hit. Well, we still had Prohibition, and now we have a Depression. So, needless to say, people weren't traveling as much. They weren't coming to the area. And after I died, Ferdinand, or actually Fred, or the other thing people in town started calling him was Dad. He had been there for so long, everybody in town just started calling him Dad. Well, he was quite shaken when I passed away, and he decided maybe it was time to give the hotel to Otis, who had married Ella. And Ella had met Otis in the hotel when he was a bartender. He was quite a dashing young man and very smooth talker, I must say. And they fell in love and they married and they moved to Pontiac and back, and he helped at different times. But he decided, actually it was in 1923, that he was going to give up the hotel, and Otis and Ella took it over. And they ran it as well as they could, given the fact that they're in a depression, national depression, and Prohibition was still in effect. And in 1929, it just couldn't make it anymore, and they sold it to the Knights of Columbus. Well, the Knights of Columbus managed to keep that hotel going in spite of all those things. In 1933, Prohibition ended. And in 1937, a very interesting thing happened. There was a farmer driving down County Line Road, and there was a hitchhiker. It's getting a little chilly out here, isn't it? There was a hitchhiker, and the farmer, they did many times in those days, he stopped to pick up that hitchhiker. So he asked the hitchhiker, well, where are you going, young man? And the young man said, I'm going to the Lenox Hotel. So he took him to the Lenox Hotel. The young man took him into the hotel and said, I'll buy you a beer for bringing me in. So they sat there at the bar, they had a beer, and the man rented a room, and he went up to his room. Well, in the meantime, sometime during that afternoon, that young man left the room. He went over to the Pollywog store, and he bought himself a light blue shirt, a pair of gray trousers, and paid for it all with nickels. Paid for the whole outfit with nickels. Went back to his room, took a rest. 3 o'clock, he got up, and he went downstairs, and he said he was going to take the bus back to Detroit. Well, he had told the farmer that, who had picked him up, that his big plan was he was going to stay here for a little bit, he was going to go to Detroit, and then from Detroit he was going to go to Cleveland. And he was going to make a lot of money. He had big plans for himself, right? So in the meantime, word got around that there had been a fire at this Anchorville hotel. I think it was called the Days Hotel or something like that in Anchorville. Anyway, there was a fire, the hotel burned, and they were looking for a young man who they think was hitchhiking towards the area. Well, the farmer heard this. He goes to New Baltimore, and he talks to the police, and he tells them this whole story. Well, what had happened at the Anchorville Hotel was during that fire, there was a young girl that had died, and also the safe had been broken into, and the slot machine, which was a nickel slot machine. So the farmer told all of this to the New Baltimore police, who tracked him down. And so that farmer, to that day, every time he told the story, he was quite sure that the capture of that young man was due to him, because he remembered about those nickels and all of that. So, like I said, 1929 came and left, and the farmer told his story in 1937. And in June of 1939, Ferdinand passed away. Now, a month later, in July of 1939, there was a big celebration at the hotel and a big dance. And there was a young man there by the name of Norbert Singer that was at this dance. And Norbert Singer lived his entire life in Richmond. But as a young man, at this dance in 1939, he said, and I quote, he said, I had the best time of my life, because for a dumb lunk like me, I got to dance with the prettiest girls there. And he went home about 1 o'clock in the morning, and it wasn't just a couple hours later, his mother woke him up and said, the Springborn Hotel is on fire. The fire had been reported by Stan Corbett, and they got there and they put out the fire as best they could. But in 1940, it was decided that there was no saving the Springborn Hotel, so the raising of the Springborn Hotel happened in 1940. There was extensive fire in damage to the third floor, which was totally gone, and the second and first floor suffered, fire damage and water damage. But I was so thankful that Ferdinand had passed away before he saw his dream go up in flames like that. But Ferdinand Springborn brought many, many people to the Richmond area, and what a joyous thing that was for Richmond. That's our story. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
This is, I didn't point this out, but I will now.
That was-
I'm done, if you're done. That's the Grand Trunk Railroad. There, and you can see a man with his 2 children. And this was me looking at my photo album. And this are, by the way, Clarence Flower photos.
Okay,
Yep, the hotel. And in the chapel, you can see the hotel, what it looked like after the fire. And this is a picture of the hotel, probably one of their parties. You can see all the people on the 2nd floor. And down by the hotel in the saloon. Can you imagine what great events those would be?
So was Springborn Road, was that where their farm was in China?
You know what? I don't know that. It probably was.
Named after the
That's
family.
yeah, that's a very good question, because quite often that's exactly what they
What
did.
happened, yeah.
Yeah. This is a picture of the hotel after the fire, taken from the back.
Here, can we?
Sure.
Yeah. Something all on the Grand Trunk.
I know.
Something. You see it?
So did the Springborn family always live in the hotel, or did they have
No,
a home in
they'd
town?
spend on and off in the hotel, but they also had a home there, and it was located next to Mr. Girk. He was their
okay.
neighbor at one time.
Yeah, was that on Kirk Street or?
You know, I've tried to find that out, and it's so hard getting those addresses.
I know.
Yeah, that's really difficult. I'm assuming it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well,
Because the building there is the
Yeah.
RAHGS store. I wonder if you lived
Yeah.
around that area.
I never knew that there was such a thing as the Lennox Hotel.
yeah.
Yeah.
Lennox Hotel, Hotel Lennox, Springborn Hotel, same building. It had 3 names, kind of a
Yeah.
thing, you know. But
The
yeah.
Prohibition was